I have a couple of questions, and
Sure.
Your observation that the trust in the American democracy is declining, and also confidence in government's ability to deliver is also relatively low. Quite striking, although the economic situation is picking up. Of course, we have inflation concern. So, do you think it's and also you mentioned American people are relatively inward looking, and and interest in the global leadership is declining. So it's a bit concerned. Do you think it's a long-term trend in the American society and American posture in the global setting? That's my first question.
I mean, there's really two questions there. I mean, there's this long-term trend in Americans believing that the country's on the wrong track. And bear in mind that in some of those years, the economy was doing very well. That I think says something about the psychology of Americans. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I think that it is disturbing that I think we presume that if things are going well, people feel good, and as a result, they feel good about democracy. They feel good about the country, you know, that doesn't seem to be the case. And the fact that that the economy seems to have rebounded so strongly, and admittedly we have COVID, and admittedly we have inflation, but those are really the only, I mean, they're major issues, but they're not, you know, they're not the only issues. And you have 63% of Americans say that the Biden government has done nothing in his year in office. It does seem to me calls into question what Joe Biden has said a number of times. And I must admit, I believe that, you know, the greatest defense or the best defense against autocracy and, you know, kind of autocratic governments is that democracy needs to deliver for its people, right? It needs to solve problems for its people. Well, this democracy in the last year solved a lot of problems, not all of them, but a lot of them. And yet people don't seem to care. And that I think is very unnerving and disturbing, because does it suggest, is it another indicator of what we know is the case in American politics based on other public opinion, that we are an increasingly tribal society? And we know from the Pew surveys that we did when I was at Pew, Republicans want to live in certain kinds of houses in certain kind of neighborhoods with certain kind of neighbors, and Democrats want to live in other kinds of houses and other kinds of neighborhoods and with other kinds of neighbors. You know, we self-segregate ourselves around people only who think like us. And that Republicans want their politicians to stand on principle, and Democrats want their politicians to compromise. And both Republicans and Democrats think the other side is a threat to the country. And so it's as if the country is dividing itself into like two boxers into their corners. And I think that's very disturbing. Now, in terms of the international situation, you know, we have always been, except for brief instances after in World War II or in World War I, where we engaged in the world and went out into the world, we have been an inward-looking country, isolationist country, protectionist country. Now, after World War II, there was a long period where we didn't act that way. We were the hegemon, and we acted like a hegemon. But even that has, I think, dramatically deteriorated. I mean, the pull out of Afghanistan is a perfect example. We were there for 20 years, but we finally said we'd had enough. But this, I think, builds on a growing sense that I think the president felt that there were burdens we could not bear internationally anymore. And I think this is a controversial thing to say, but I think that I believe we have to accept that America is in relative decline. And the important word is relative there, right? We're in decline relative to China. We are still the world's strongest economy. We are still the world's strongest military power. We're not, going the way of the Romans or something. But the point is, we are not the superpower we once were. And that is requiring a great deal of adjustment by people, by Americans. And some Americans, when they realize that, say, well, we just should turn our back on the world. If we can't run the world, then we should give up. And other Americans are trying to wrestle with what it means to be in not the superpower we once were. And then there are some Americans who still believe, well, of course we can still do things. We shouldn't have left Afghanistan, and we can do this. And there's not a whole lot of support for that in public opinion.
Thank you very much. Your last remark is very sort of insightful and enlightening. I think the relative decline of superpowers needs adjustment, even in the American politics, domestic politics, as well as I think attitude on the side of other countries and allies.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I've been doing a lot of interviewing in Europe recently, and what's interesting is that Europeans want America to continue to be as fully engaged in the defense of Europe as we have in the past. And we are, to a certain extent. I mean, Biden has actually increased the number of troops a little bit, American troops in Europe. We're now in the middle of negotiations with the Russians about defending Ukraine. That's good. But the attention of America is increasingly in Asia, and it's increasingly about China. And, I would argue the pivot to Asia is inevitable for the United States. That's where the direct security threat to the United States comes from. That's where the future economy is of the world. And we are inexorably pivoting to Asia. And that means, not absolutely, but relatively, we're not going to be able to do as much with Europe as we did in the past. And it is very troubling to the Europeans, and it is very troubling to Americans of my generation, who were transatlanticists. We were Europeanists. We were, Japan was this country on the other side of the world and we didn't know much about, but Europe was where the action was. And that is increasingly not the case. And all of us adjusting to that and adjusting how we think about the world and how we act in the world and what we expect of other countries has got to change. And there's no roadmap for this. It's just we have to kind of feel it out.
I see. Pivot to Asia, you said, and I think so. U.S. commitment in terms of defense in the Asia Pacific is sort of very strong. And but how about in terms of trade and economic side? And
well, I mean, this is a very good example. First off, I would like to compliment Japan and the new Japanese government, which has increased its spending on defense. Plans to increase its spending on defense, which I think is long overdue and very important and much appreciated in the United States. And the statements that Japan has made about Taiwan were very much appreciated. On trade, though, you raise a very interesting question. We failed to finish the TPP negotiations and get it passed by Congress, and Trump pulled out of TPP. And frankly, it's not at all clear that if Clinton had won that election, she could have gotten the Congress to approve TPP. We just don't know. But the Biden administration really has not re-engaged on trade. I mean, they have these ideas of different kinds of economic engagement, which hasn't led to anything much. Meanwhile, China's trying to join the successor to TPP. Frankly, I do not foresee the Biden administration, even if it gets reelected, I'm not sure that they would try to join TPP or its successor. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, because the reality is TPP was supposed to be the joint response to the China economic challenge. We were going to set the rules of the game, and the Chinese would have to play by our rules or not. With China trying to join the successor to TPP, I know there are some in the Japanese government who would like to see that happen, or maybe think it's inevitable. And if America were part of TPP, this would have never happened. And I think the Chinese look at this and say, if we join, we can over time, change the organization's rules to be more Chinese-oriented rules. And but Americans have only themselves to blame for that. And I mean, the Abe government took on its internal foes in the negotiation on TPP and dealt with its own internal opposition and got this approved. And the US, who more or less this was our idea, we couldn't do it. So shame on us.
How about Biden administration's new proposal on the new trade framework in the Pacific?
Right. If you know what that means, could you tell me? I mean, I think that the problem is, at least currently, it is an idea without much substance. What I think they're trying to do is, can we have an agreement that deals with the kind of future issues, whether it's digital economy or things like that, and avoid all the difficult issues that we've had in the past, like agriculture or steel or whatever. Given the domestic political situation in the US, where the Biden administration needs support of the union movement, and it needs the support of industrial America, the heartland of America, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, they cannot politically afford to look like they're going to do a trade agreement that might lead to more competition in America. So I think what they're trying to do is to find some issues where there might not be the domestic political opposition. The problem, it seems to me, is that A, we don't know, we don't have deals like that. So you're kind of inventing something out of whole cloth, which is difficult. And B, people like us can't explain what that means. How are they going to explain this to the average American? And I think that's going to be one of the challenges they face.
Yeah, focusing on new issues like digital and overseas infrastructure development and partnering of the supply chain, maybe new issue, but I think it's sellable. I
hope. And look, my pet issue is that we and the Japanese and the Europeans, for that matter, have an interest in the development of emerging technologies, whether it be, next generation computer chips or AI or advanced robotics or synthetic biology or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those, the research and development in those things is incredibly expensive, frightfully expensive, requires huge amounts of scientific talent. And to justify the effort, you need to have a big market at the end of the day. And frankly, I've talked to some people in METI a couple of years ago who were saying, we need to work together on, 6G, not 5G. We need to work together on advanced semiconductors. And I think they're right. And I think that I would wish the Biden administration would be proposing to the Japanese, let's do pre-competitive research and development together. At the end of the day, the whatever we develop will then, be available to our commercial firms to compete against each other as they will. But we should both put up money and scientific talent to develop these new technologies, because we know that the Chinese are investing enormous amounts of money. They have very good scientific talent, and they not only have a huge market, but through the Belt and Road Initiative, they're trying to expand that market. And we need to counter that.
In that perspective, does it matter, the situation where the US is going into the midterm election, does it relate to that prospect of the new such a kind of framework?
No, I don't think so. I think, what I just said, most American voters would know what I was talking about. And if they did understand it a little bit, they would say, you want us to cooperate with who? The Japanese? Are you crazy? And I think, that's one of the problems a politician in America faces, that there's still this sense that, we don't need the help of anybody else. We can do this. But I can tell you, in extensive conversations I've had with people in Silicon Valley, who 10 years ago would have said, we don't need to cooperate with anybody. We're the lords of the universe. They will now say, no, we need to cooperate with other people. This is too difficult. It's too expensive. And there are ways to do this that don't violate the need for competition, because at the end of the day, these are capitalists. They want to compete. But the difficulties that we face in a number of emerging technology areas suggest we would do well to cooperate with. And I can tell you on one issue, semiconductors, the legislation that has passed the Senate, hasn't passed the House yet, that says we want to put some money into semiconductors. And the US will, I think, eventually put multiple billions of dollars into semiconductors. There's a line in that legislation that says, and wherever possible, we should cooperate with our foreign allies. When I talk to people in the White House, they will acknowledge that. They will say, yes, we should really do that. But I don't see any evidence they're doing it. And I think that we should try to, those of us who care about the US-Japan relationship, for example, try to push that. I know there's been some conversations between the Japanese government and the US government about this. I think it is exactly the kind of thing we should be doing. And frankly, I don't think it's going to be that politically controversial, because it's too much in the weeds. It's too much. Most people won't notice it, and they won't understand it. And that's good, because what we want to do is produce those new technologies for their use.
I see. Thank you very much. If I may, in terms of China, I think of course, geopolitically tension is heightening between the two powers, but American industries and especially Wall Street are heavily engaged in their activities in China. What does the whole calculation, politics and economics vis-a-vis China?
Look, I think you put your finger on a very important issue, is that American companies, and Wall Street in particular, is deeply, deeply invested in China. That's not going to change overnight, nor frankly should it. I mean, many of these investments are good investments. I think there has been an underappreciation in America, but Japan faces the same problem. Those investments are also hostage to the Chinese. The Chinese can squeeze those investments anytime they want to. And you will remember when there was this these controversies over the islands with China and Japan, that all of a sudden there were all these demonstrations and Japanese companies in front of the factories and et cetera. So we have ourselves in a very difficult position where, for example, the U.S. is trying to get Europe in particular to work with us on human rights abuses in China and to sanction the Chinese. But the Chinese have said, we can make life difficult for European companies if you do this. And I think that that's going to be something that we're not going to be able to resolve anytime soon. I would hope that given the effort to rebalance our supply chains, where we learned some hard lessons during COVID, will mean that our companies are less dependent on Chinese production. And actually, based on what the Chinese did to Australia recently, we should also be very wary of being too dependent on exports to China as well. Now, that's easier for me to say. I don't export anything to China. I don't have any investments in China. If I'm the CEO of a company, that's a lot harder to do. I appreciate that. But I think that hopefully one of the lessons we've learned from COVID is that when you put all your eggs in one basket, you're really risking danger. And to put it in a broader context, you studied a lot of economics in university. I studied a lot of economics in university. We are all of a generation where economics is the rationale for doing almost everything, right? If it's cheaper, you do it there. You build it here, you sell it there because it's cheaper. That may not be the wisest thing to do going forward. That we need to realize that maybe some things, even though they're slightly more expensive, if they're more secure, that's worth paying a little bit more in the short run.
Thank you. In terms of the basket for the eggs, other basket for the eggs, which region do you think in your mind? Southeast Asia and India and other parts of the world?
Well, Americans have always had this love affair with India, before COVID, I went to India at least once a year, and I must admit, there's something very attractive to me about India, and India has repeatedly broken our hearts, right? It never seems to be able to become. I mean, there was an old joke in America about Brazil was the country that was always coming but never arrived, and India, to a certain extent, is the country that is always coming but never arrives. And I mean, it should become a huge production site for you and for us and for the rest of the world, for the Europeans. It has a potentially huge consumer market, and already a huge consumer market. It could be much bigger. And so I guess I'm ever hopeful, but it has enormous infrastructure needs. The poverty is still very debilitating for the society and for the economy. The disparities in not only income but kind of in social status and the lingering parts of the caste system, et cetera, make it very difficult to deal with. And of course, you have Hindu nationalism now, which is my personal view is quite dangerous. Although I'll tell you, Pew recently did a survey, which I recommend to your listeners, of the Indian population. It would appear that the Indian government is much more nationalistic than the Indian people in terms of Hindu nationalism, which is encouraging. Southeast Asia, certainly. I'll look at Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam has become a major supplier to the United States and a major investment place for the United States. I'm of the Vietnam War age. If you had told me 50 years ago that this would be a major place to produce, I would have told you you're insane. So I think that that's very heartening. So I do think the issue really is, I think not the short term, but the medium and long term issue is, can Africa ever become the next major production site? I'll tell you, years ago, and this is now, I would say 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I remember asking the head of the Electronic Industries Association in the United States, which is a lobbying group for all the major electronics producers in the United States. I said to him, I know that you members now produce a lot in China, and some of them are thinking about Southeast Asia, but 20, 30 years down the road, where are they going to be producing? And without hesitating, he said, Africa. And I said, you're out of your mind. There's all this poverty, there's no infrastructure, there's these civil wars. That's not going to happen in Africa. And he said, you're describing China 50 years ago. And there's differences. I mean, no African country has pulled itself together the way China has in the last 20 years. But do bear in mind, Ethiopia, before its current civil war, was the fastest growing country in the economy and in the continent. And a lot of it had to do because there was production moving to Ethiopia. It is the continent with the fastest growing population. And it will have low wage rates for many years. And if it gets infrastructure, and I think the interesting thing is, if the Chinese actually are serious about building infrastructure, we can complain all we want about they're going to exploit people and they're not going to, kind of treat them right. But one might presume that the Chinese are saying, we want to produce in Africa, but we have to get the infrastructure right first. And we'll see in 20 years whether there's a lot of Chinese manufacturing locating in Africa.
I see. Thank you very much for very thorough presentation. If I may, you're okay. I would like to check with my colleague for the last question to you.
Sure.
Mr. Stokes,
hi.
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture, as always. I learned a lot from you today, such as China is historically unfavorable country for the United States.
Right.
I feel that, but I didn't know there's such kind of a concrete number. And Japan is historically a favorable country for the US. It's a very nice news for us. And
Yeah.
Taiwan has a public support in the U.S. That's very encouraging for the Taiwan people and neighboring Japan. Thanks again for last lecture just before U.S. 2020 presidential election. It was also very, very insightful one. The future of the world depends on the United States and China. So the world is paying the attention to the U.S. political trends, and the current political trends in the United States are very, very much influenced by the public opinion. So, and you are the best researcher of the U.S. public opinion trends. So that is a world watching you and your opinion. Of course, the Japanese audience including. I have three questions. Sorry for the time is running out, but you mentioned in your article on the website of GMF, the American identity is crisis, and poll shows Americans don't believe in the American democracy. So my first question is that how can such kind of divided United States can be repaired? The COVID-19 can be the one of the remedy to unite the country, but I think it seems it doesn't work like that. So this is the first question. The second is
look, it's a very good question, and I sighed because I don't have an answer to your question. One might have expected before COVID that a major health crisis like that would bring the country together. And yet we have about 25%, 30% of the population that not only has not been vaccinated, but refuses to get vaccinated. I mean, it's become a political issue.
Right.
It's us against them. If you tell me I'm supposed to get vaccinated, then I'm not going to get vaccinated. And even though I could die from it and I could kill my children or my parents or whatever as a result. I think that the article that you alluded to, I'm personally very concerned about the fact that I think that on a whole range of issues, and we talked about this in a past RIETI discussion, the pace of change in America is accelerating. And I think this has been very stressful, and we have underestimated how stressful it is. That the percentage of foreign-born people has tripled in the last 50 years. The percentage of non-white people has tripled in the last 50 years. The percentage of people employed in manufacturing has gone down by 2/3. Until recently, at least, incomes had stagnated for almost a half a century. And gay people have come out of the closet, and women have gone into the workforce, and all of those things are good. My personal view is those are all good things, but they all happen at once. And I, for one, would never want to turn back the clock on any of those things, except the stagnation of wages. I'd like to stop that. But what do you do with white men my age, whose incomes have stagnated for their entire adult life? Their fathers did not have to compete with women in the workforce, but they do. Their fathers made enough money so their mothers didn't have to work, but they have never made enough money so that their wife always has to work. That's not women's liberation. That's just necessity. There are more and more foreigners around. And oh, by the way, they are foreigners of color. They aren't kind of Northern Europeans. And I think that all of that together has put incredible stress on a minority of the population, which, voted for Donald Trump, who said, I can take you back to the 1950s when none of this existed. And going forward, one of the difficulties is, how do you help people adapt to this new world? And yes, it would help if wages go up and income distribution improves. but that's only one piece of it. Go back to our discussion before where, we think all of these things can be solved by economics, but some of them can't. Some of them have to do with human psychology. So I think that's the real challenge we face in American politics going forward. And, and Joe Biden is a man of a different era. And that was kind of soothing to people, even though he's not Donald Trump. Joe Biden never said, I'm going to take you back to the 1950s. But he certainly is not the person to take us into the 2030s and 2040s either. I mean, he's not of that generation.
Okay, thank you very much. Because of the time constraints, I would like to skip 2 questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, sure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stokes, for very wonderful insights, and also thank you for sharing your very precious time. And we learned a lot, and you enlightened the Japanese audience very much. Thank you very much again. And
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Good night. Well, good morning to everyone. Good night to me.
Good night.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.